Greetings. We want to thank everyone for joining us on this Martin Luther King Jr. Day 2021. On behalf of the Minnesota Historical Society and our guests, I'm happy to welcome you to our program, Acting on Dr. King's Call. Before we begin, even though we are in a virtual space, we do want to acknowledge that we are on the ancestral homelands of the Dakota and Ojibwe people. And we want to pay our respects to elders, past and present. We'd also like to honor the past, present, and ongoing efforts of the Dakota and Ojibwe people to steward and care for this land. And now, to get into our conversation, I'd like to first introduce our guests. We could put those slides up to show the audience who we have with us today. First and foremost, we have Leslie Redmond. She is an attorney, public speaker, and civil rights advocate. At the age of 25, many of you will know, she became the youngest president of the Minneapolis NAACP. She is a fiery speaker, an inspired visionary around racial justice, and founder of the brand Don't Complain, Activate. Next, we have Edrin Williams, the dynamic pastor and leader of the Sanctuary Covenant Church in Minneapolis. Pastor Williams uses biblical teaching, humor, storytelling, and his incredible wit, background in humanities, social sciences, to underscore the theology of liberation that defines his work, and to help think about how we can shape society and influence others in the ways of Jesus. Last but not least, we have Adair Mosley, who is president and CEO of Pillsbury United Communities, a pioneering community impact agency in Minneapolis. Adair seeks radical and inclusive solutions to the community's most urgent needs, co-created with the people most affected. He also is a dynamic leader in his own right, and we are very lucky to have him join us as well today. The subject of our conversation today is not simply the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's birth, but the message that he delivered, particularly in light of the events of January 6th. And so today we're going to talk about a lesser known address that Dr. King gave in 1967 to the American Psychological Association on what he called creative maladjustment. What King argued in that essay is that psychologists had given the world a great term in maladjustment, this concept that there are times when people are not quite acclimated to their society and culture, and that maladjustment was something that needed to be conquered. But King suggested to those that were in attendance that day that there was also a way to think about creative maladjustment in dealing with issues of racial inequality in America. King argued, in fact, that there are some things in society, some things in this world to which we should never become adjusted, including poverty, racial inequality, the denial of equal rights to people of color, to LGBTQ communities, religious bigotry, Islamophobia, the list goes on. We've assembled today a group of panelists, Leslie Redmond, Edrin Williams, Adair Mosley, whose organizations and personal activism embody the very essence of what Dr. King talked about in that work. And I'm going to begin by asking them each what that message means to them. I want to begin with Pastor Williams, primarily, Edrin, because as a faith leader, you are in the tradition of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. People sometimes forget to acknowledge the fact that these were faith leaders and they operated on that plane. Can you talk about what Dr. King's message of creative maladjustment has meant to your work and how faith informs your work?
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Williams, for the introduction. And thank you, Leslie and Adair, for letting me hang out a little bit with you guys and learn from you. When I think about creative maladjustment, particularly from a faith perspective, it has to do with, first, how comfortable we are with the brokenness in this world. When Dr. King said there are some things that we should not be adjusted to, we should never be adjusted to, I agree that there are just some things that are so wrong when it comes to our world, our country, our nation, that I don't want to be okay with it. I don't want to be comfortable with it. I don't want to see it and then say, oh, that's just the way it is. There are some things for which we should always say that's wrong, that's broken, that's less than God's best for us from a faith perspective. And I think when I think about Dr. King, I'm particularly You think about the way the Beehive is about Beyonce. That's how I am about Dr. King. Like I'm selfish about Dr. King. I don't let people just talk about him as MLK. I'm like, let's call him Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, because his faith was what compelled him to do the things that he did. And a part of it was that his faith, his Christian faith, his faith in Jesus gave him a vision of this world that was and was to come. And he was always working towards what he later labeled the beloved community. And so from a faith perspective, I don't have to imagine what it would be like for our world to be better. I've already been given an image of it, and I am day in and day out working towards that beloved community. And so when the work gets hard, when it seems impossible, when I want to personally quit, when I'm afraid that I might lose my life in the course of doing this work, this image of the beloved community and my faith, knowing that God is with me in this work and I'm doing God's work, that is what allows me to keep going. And I think there are many examples through Dr. King's life, through Malcolm's life, where their faith allowed them to do things that they could not do on their own.
Thank you, Edwin. Appreciate that. I'm going to stay with you for just a second, because I think that was on display in this community in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd. And I remember you talking about feeding people. And you said, look, it wasn't just about, satisfying their hunger in that moment. It was about having a message to offer in the absence of the spiritual sustenance. Can you talk a little bit about how important faith is in moments of trauma, particularly for communities of color?
Yeah, it's hard, Dr. Williams, to really understand the Black experience in America divorced from faith. I know there, particularly in progressive circles, like people are suspicious of faith, and they want to keep the church out of the nonprofit sector. And there are numbers of grants that we can't even get to do the good work we're doing because we're a church. But you cannot serve the Black community in particular. And I'm a Baptist preacher, grew up Baptist, so I'm sweating already. You cannot talk about the well-being of our community and divorce that from the church. When we had nothing else, when there were no other institutions that would serve us, the church served us. It helped us in civic engagement and education. It became a place where we might gather and set a standard for our kids and paint a picture for them that despite what they saw in their day-to-day lives, there was a better day ahead for them. And to think that now there's a suspicion of whether or not the church is relevant and helpful for Black and brown people is asinine in my mind. And I think a part of reclaiming Dr. King's legacy is reminding people that faith was a core aspect of what made him do the things he did, and what made him get up when that work knocked him down.
I appreciate that, Edwin. Leslie, I'm going to go to you next. And I know faith is important to you, but I have to ask you this. You were 25 years old when you took over the mantle of the NAACP in Minneapolis. Aside from just being astounded by your youth, I'm also reminded this summer after the passing of John Lewis, your commentary that we sometimes forget that the civil rights leaders themselves were very young when they took on those responsibilities. Can you speak specifically to the importance of recognizing youth activism in this moment around the issues that are affecting our society as a whole, particularly around racial injustice?
100%. Even when we think about activists, but even when we think about from faith, Jesus started his ministry at 30, right? And so when we think historically, the people who have changed the world have always been young people. And one of the things that I remind people, yesterday I was a part of Miss Rose McGee's Sweet Potato Comfort Pie event, and it was an intergenerational conversation because I was having a conversation with Generation Z. Right. I think people look at me as being a young millennial, but my first protest was 10 years ago, a little over 10 years ago. Right. And so that work has always started at a very young age. And so while people might look at me as young, I think we need to recognize that there's always been young people who are going to take to the streets. And I'm looking forward to really getting the next generation ready. Amen. Because I'm not trying to be in the streets forever. I totally understand when the elders and the older generations are not in the street, and I think about Adair and Pillsbury and the role that they played when we were out there making sure that our community wasn't being burned to the ground. I think about Bishop Howe allowing us to use his space as a station. I think about Sammy's Avenue Eatery allowing us to use the space. Sanctuary is right there where we were protecting as well, right? There really is a beloved community, right? And I think about Ashley Henderson, who's a comedian, but in that moment, she was making sure that people had resources, right? Another young person. There are artists who are making sure that the movement is not forgotten. When I think about the people being, again, arrested, like I was arrested in Louisville, Kentucky, and the people on the highways, there's always young people at the forefront of these movements. And so I think that that's something that, even the Bible says we cannot use our youth as an excuse, right? And so really we should uplift people. And that's one of the reasons why even the new president for the Minneapolis NAACP, Angela Rose, is 25, right? Like, that's not a coincidence that God positioned her at the same age that he positioned me, right? And so I'm super excited for the future and what is to come. And I believe that young people will continue to stay at the forefront of activism.
Now, I want to ask you a little bit later in our conversation, Leslie, about the importance of Black women and Black women's voices in activism. You just mentioned Angela, you talked about yourself. But before we do that, you and Edwin kind of represent pillars in our community in terms of the faith and the church, the Black church, and the law. Can you talk a little bit about why you decided to go to law school, what you hope to accomplish with that degree? You are in the great tradition of Constance Baker Motley and Thurgood Marshall and all these incredible attorneys. And yet, in the moment after you passed the bar, you decided to go into activism. What motivated? Where did that come from?
Well, 100%. And one, I always tell people, I love the Lord, right? And so we can't just look at people who are in faith as pastors, right? While I'm not a pastor, I almost got actually a double minor in theology because I took so many theology classes, and I grew up Baptist like Pastor Williams, and I go to Shiloh Temple International now, but I love the Lord, and I've never been to a protest where God wasn't at the center. And I actually don't even give too many speeches where I'm not giving a prayer at the end, right? And so God is very much so at the center of everything that I do, and I just want to make sure I give him the glory and the honor. And so we know I'm an activist, but I'm a kingdom builder first and foremost. But to answer your question and to dive into it, I think that law, while I don't like it a lot, because law, as Reverend King is talking about, Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King, has really hindered us a lot of the time. We talk about maintaining law and order. A lot of the time we're talking about maintaining inequities, right? And that's exactly what he was talking about. So for me, I wanted to be the change that I wanted to see. When I was in 4th grade, I had a cousin, Kevin, who I loved dearly, who was always being incarcerated. And I asked my big mom, who I love dearly, I asked her, Grandma, who decides if Kevin goes to jail or not? And she said the judge. And so I'm like, oh, I'm gonna be a judge, because something's wrong with this system. And so as a young girl growing up in the inner city of Washington, D.C., well, I didn't know about the terminology of the war on drugs and gentrification, all these things. I saw it in real life, which is why I tell people, do not underestimate people's lived experience and that they are the real experts, right? And so that always really guides me in this work. And now I've decided I'm really meant to be a judge like Deborah in the Bible, not for the United States of America. But that's neither here nor there. I want people to know my activism didn't start when I got sworn in for the bar February the 18th, which would have been Big Ma's 95th birthday, which was really inspired by trying to get Mayan Burrell free from prison, which shout out to everybody that activated to free him. And now we're working on another innocence case. Just want to throw that out there. But I want to say my activism started even, like I said, long before that. But while I was in law school, when I was 23 years old, when our brother Jamar Clark was murdered in North Minneapolis, was really, I would say, when I started organizing, right? There's one thing to be at the protest, but really when I got on the ground, and I want to shout out Makima Levy Armstrong, who was my law professor at the time, who was the president of Minneapolis NAACP, who really helped me to get out there and to make sure that I was boots on the ground in the community, activating in a real meaningful way, because a lot of us want to wait until we're successful and have money and pass the bar in order to help and activate. But injustice isn't waiting. White supremacy isn't waiting. Racism isn't waiting, and neither can we.
Thank you, Leslie. And I always love how you connect the dots in terms of the activists in our community, which brings me to Adair, who, we can talk about Pillsbury in just a second, but Adair, I want to talk about your story because it's so fascinating. I see you in many ways as a social engineer. someone who's looking how you can connect the dots in a range and variety of places. Where does that fire come from, Adair? Where does that passion come from with you?
Yeah, thank you. And I am glad to be here amongst these wonderful evangelists and storytellers of the moment. And as Pastor Williams was speaking, I said, we've come this far by faith. And it's really at the center, and it's the foundation. And I believe it's all of our kind of personal ethos as we move through this work. What gives me the fire is that I committed and recommitted, if you will, to every day waking up and running an urgent race to change the inequities, the broken systems in our really in our society that have downstream and enduring really impact on Black bodies. And it is that I will never become complacent with what is, and I believe that is the message of Dr. King, right? This creative maladjustment. And that I'm always trying to seek out, one of the quotes we put out recently for this day was, Dr. King said that it was moving beyond just having true compassion for the beggar that asked for something, that it was about going to see the edifices that were created that creates the conditions for the beggar. And I want to make sure that I go and try to look at those edifices every day, to dismantle them, to reconstruct them in equitable ways. And I believe we can get there. And so I'm driven by that personal space of really just saying, what do we have to do? What is my calling? As Leslie was saying, my godmom reminded me too, that Dr. King was our age, right? When he started this work. And so I'm trying to always, I know that we stand on the shoulders of our ancestors and lean into it constantly and daily. And so that's really what's my own personal drive to creating this lasting change.
Now, let's talk about Pillsbury there, because what I love is when we talk about creative maladjustment, the word creative is there. So it's the idea about how we can think through exactly what you described. Walk me through some of the innovative programs that you are doing there, because I would argue that if you want to see what creative maladjustment looks like on the ground, you can see that in the work of Pillsbury United.
Yes, thank you. And, it is such an honor to be leading a 140-year-old institution. And I think that that's important because I believe you only get there through relevancy. And that means constantly putting a lens of creativity through the work and making sure that we're meeting the need of the moment. And I'm just deeply honored to be stewarding this organization in this moment. Pillsbury United Communities is, I started its work out of charity and really doing work and working alongside community. And I think today, but it has always had this entrepreneurial spirit that says, how do we reconstruct the system that it's beyond looking at it through a traditional lens of case management. It's beyond thinking that our people need fixing. It's really about tapping into the aspirations and the hopes and the dreams that they have for themselves and their families and figuring out a way to align our systems, our policies, our infrastructure to meet those aspirations and dreams. And that is the institution that we're building today. I want to give a shout out to one of our most loyal customers, Pastor Williams here, because North Market, I believe, serves as a great example of that. It's a grocery store we built in North Minneapolis a little over 3 years ago. And there could have been a traditional way of solving for what community asked for, which would have been standing up another food shelf. And that's oftentimes how we come and think about Black and brown communities, is through the lens of charity. But what people were really saying to us is that we want you to restore dignity in our community. That it means something to have a grocery store that we don't have to travel outside of our community to be able to have access to. And I think that that's the lens by which we're doing this work, is every moment that we stand up an innovative solution, it's about restoring dignity, the things that have been long denied in our community to Black bodies, right? And things that other communities take for granted that have been systematically, all of that, like oppressed systems that have been just really encumbering our communities. And it's my goal, it's our organization's goal, is to continue to dismantle those. So that's certainly one example. And I'll lastly say is about 2 years ago, I rolled out a new strategy And that strategy was only focused on upstream solutions. It was only thinking about the edifices. That I wasn't going to say, how do we stand up more food shelves? How do we stand up more social and basic human services? And not that those things are not important. But if we are to have enduring change, we have to dismantle and reconstruct equitable systems. And that strategy is focused clearly on doing that.
You know, first of all, I have to say to the audience, even though we're virtual, if you can't feel the energy that's being generated by these three individuals in this moment, but I think you have to talk about the shadow of this moment as well. So, and we'll do this in the round. So I'm not going to direct this in any one place. I'll just kind of ask each of you to weigh in. January 6th weighs heavily on this Martin Luther King Day as we think about what's happening in the nation as a whole. Thinking about the work that all of you do in community and how we're thinking about activism going forward in the shadow of George Floyd, in the shadow of the global pandemic, in the shadow of what Adair brilliantly calls the edifices of inequality. What is the message that you want to share this King Day about where we need to be headed in the next few months? And I want to begin with you, Pastor.
Yeah, I think the very clear work that I see myself being in part responsible for, even before January 6th, was to continue to remind us that we have come a very long way, but there's still a lot of work to be done. Some people would have us to think that the need to really dive into this justice work is past. Like we had a Black president, we've crossed that bridge. But I think if there's anything January 6th reminded us is that there's a reason white supremacy has been around and has flourished for so long, because it is aggressive, and it is it's not just going to lie down. Like it has to be killed. It has to be rooted out. And as long as you play with it and pet it and just sort of, they just don't know any better. Let's just leave them alone. Let's not be too harsh on them. Then you give white supremacy the opportunity to recreate itself, to grow, be strengthened, to catch its second breath, and then come back. And I think that's what we've seen over the last 4 years. And the reality is now, more than ever, even prior to 2008, I feel like there is a great need for us to root out and dismantle white supremacy in every single system in our society. You name me a system, it is infiltrated by white supremacy. Education. There's a reason why our kids are educated or not educated the way they should be. Healthcare. There's a reason why it is as dangerous for us to go to the hospital to get the care we need as it is to stay at home. Buying a house. Why is it so much harder and more expensive for us to get adequate housing? Every single system in this country has been infiltrated and is infiltrated by white supremacy. And so a part of my work, even as a pastor, and most people think pastors are supposed to make people feel good, I see myself first as a prophet, pointing out there's something broken about what's going on here. And there is a way for us to fix what's broken without ourselves becoming the evil that we're trying to root out. Because what I don't want us to do is to simply replace white supremacy with whatever our version of it would be. I think there is a way to build that beloved community. I go back to that in such a way to say there is a way beyond what capitalism teaches us for us to care for one another, for everyone to have enough. And I love what Adair talked about. The work will be more creative than it needs to be more creative than it's ever been before, because we can't simply keep putting Band-Aids on the work.
Now, Pastor, inherent in King's final, and throughout his life, but certainly in his final book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, is this critique of capitalism as in the market, as a driver of inequality. I want to pick back up on that with you and Adair, but first I want to ask you, Leslie, you may have had the line of the summer this year when you compared Minnesota to a white Wakanda. And when I saw the events on January 6th, I have to plainly admit, I had said to someone on the telephone, what we're seeing are the death throes of what Leslie Redmond described this summer. Can you talk about why you use that analogy and how, because I would argue that Dr. King also came up against that and with deadly consequences, but you called that this summer. What are we witnessing here in America? What do people need to know about this, and how deeply it's ingrained in our society and culture?
100%. I stand by those words. This is a white Wakanda in Minneapolis, in Minnesota, and America is like the epitome of a white Wakanda. And this is even what I meant when I said Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was talking about, you know, the threat of maintaining order often means maintaining inequality. It becomes a question of order for who, right? Because this summer, when I sat on a lawn to demand justice for Breonna Taylor, a young Black woman that reminds me so much of myself that was murdered in her home, I was threatened with a felony charge and 2 misdemeanors for sitting on a lawn. Now, I couldn't imagine us breaking into the Capitol, stealing from the Capitol, and living to talk about it, right? And so I think something that you said is very important, because this has been a buildup. They've been breaking into capitals all summer and no consequences. White supremacists came to North Minneapolis this summer and was shooting at us and was burning down our communities, and no one said anything. This is a buildup. And the question that you asked earlier about how do we go forward, I really want to address it really quickly. One, reparations now. If there's going to be any effort for Black people to be able to have any stance in America, we need reparations for the harm that has been done. And if you don't consider yourself like the people that broke into the Capitol and the domestic terrorism that the Black community has faced for centuries in this country, then you need to stand with us for reparations. And you need to also recognize that this is not about white versus Black. This is about everybody versus white supremacy, right? And in order for us to get justice, you're going to have to give up some of your privilege and give up some of your power, just like I did this summer when I was arrested for the first time. I never been arrested. I never planned on being arrested. But we're going to have to get out of our comfort. And so something else that was acknowledged during this conversation is, while I recognize that faith has played a tremendous role, the church does need to step up, period, and point blank, because Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was on the ground. Right. And I see people like Reverend Green, who was in the NAACP, and people like myself who was in the NAACP. And again, the church is still relevant. The NAACP is still relevant, but we all need to do more, because what happened on January 6th was showing how hard white supremacy is willing to fight. So the question becomes, how hard are we willing to fight for justice? And a lot of us are too comfortable. We become comfortable and complicit in our own oppression, and enough is enough. And I think the call has been happening for so long. I think, you know, there's always warning before destruction. And we've been getting so many warnings. I was there in 2015 when white supremacists came down and shot people at the 4th precinct. And I saw an officer with a ski mask on right before it happened that was identical to the gunman. And I talked about it on Democracy Now! And nobody acted like they heard me. So like, when we see these things, realize that this stuff didn't happen overnight and that it's nothing new. And maybe if y'all started listening to Black people proactively and not waiting until white people have to like blatantly show you who they are. And when I say white people, obviously I'm not talking about all of our white brothers and sisters. Anybody that knows what I'm saying and knows me, they know what I mean by this, right? Because obviously there's always been white people fighting with us, and there's always been some Black overseers. So I'm very aware that white supremacy is the issue. But I really need you all to give over your comfort, especially people here in Minnesota, and invite us to the table. And not only let us have a seat at the table, but let us have some power at the table. And I don't just care about your words and your rhetoric. I care about your laws, your policies, and where you putting your money. And right now we're at a crossroad. There's a lot of money coming in Minnesota, but is it going to the right places? Are we going to gentrify our communities and displace people? Or are we going to do what no other state has been able to do, which is, you know, gentrification is happening, but how do we do it in a way where the people who have been maintaining North Minneapolis in our communities are not displaced and disadvantaged? And I'll stop there.
No, I appreciate that. I think in a way, what you were also talking about is a historical phenomenon, Leslie, that we can't run from. The reality is, and we celebrate activism in organizations like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, but during the Civil Rights Movement, the only time it seemed that the government could acknowledge the legitimate demands for equality being made for Americans is when you had a white death to compound the trauma the African American community was facing. We saw that in the case of Schwerner, Chaney, and Goodman, the 3 civil rights workers were investigating church bombings in Mississippi. And then President Johnson sends flowers to the family of the 2 dead white civil rights workers does not reciprocate for James Chaney. I think it goes back to what Adair posited, and it is only at the point when it's the community that's driving that the trauma the community is facing drives the response, the intervention, that we're in a good place. Which brings me to you, Adair, because I talked about the work of Pillsbury United. I see in that work a clear connection with what organizations like the Black Panther Party and the NAACP were attempting to a certain extent in previous generations. In terms of the Panthers, meeting the needs of the community where the community was, so breakfast for school children. And I see some real clear grassroots efforts on the part of Pillsbury United to address that. But I also see this innovation, and I also see in you, and I want you to share where this, and talk about this a little bit. How do we need to not fight this war and think about the next war? I've heard you talk about this in some sense, but how do we see past the immediate and really suppose what Leslie's suggesting, the next iteration, so we don't wind up replicating the challenges we've had in the past?
Yeah, I believe we have the teachings in front of us, really. And I believe history tells us, and everything that Dr. King spoke about continues to remain relevant. It is enduring. It is the playbook. And I think it's going to need bold and courageous leaders at the forefront of it, and people who will put aside politics, people who will put aside really their own personal agendas to be able to achieve the collective good. And I believe this moment needs it. I think we have it. I believe we have those those really bold and courageous leaders who are really to fight for this level of justice. And I think the things that we need to be thinking about, to your point, is about this enduring change, right? And what are the levers that we need to pull as a society that gets us through several generations? And that's really having the long-term view. Now, I will tell you that I believe this movement calls for both, right? We need people right now in this moment that are fighting for really deep inequities and the injustices that rest, and who will not tire of that. And then we need individuals who are thinking long-term about the policies and the systems. And what we need is to understand the congruency between those two, right? And really that those two work together to create this just society that we all envision. And I think it's about all of us having the personal and moral kind of orientation to fighting towards that justice. And really finding those moments of incongruity in our systems and our policies is that I believe is what is needed. I believe in my work, as I continue to think about it, I think about it through the lens of enduring change and toward that. And our mission is toward that just society, and really thinking about what is going to be needed to sustain families and individuals and communities, and where do we want to see them go? Right? What are their, as I mentioned earlier on, what are their hopes, dreams, and aspirations, and how do we build towards that? Is really, and that you only get there through proximity with community. Is entering in community with a sense of humility, great humility, and asking communities, what do you need, rather than here's what you need. And I believe when you ask that simple question of humility, it will unearth dreams and aspirations beyond our own wild imaginations. And there's things that we constantly do as an organization that I could have never thought of. But community has the answer to its solutions. And it is up to us, those that have power and position and platforms and institutions. It is up to us to leverage those things on behalf of communities' dreams. And I believe we'll get there and be able to build something that is truly equitable in this time.
So, thank you, Adair. I'm going to ask, and by the way, the questions, the chat is blowing up in terms of people who want to ask questions. I will get to you. I promise I will give you back to these amazing leaders. But I want to indulge you for just a second and ask each of you about a book that Dr. King wrote, or at least about a title of a book, because I think the titles speak to the moment that we're in. Pastor, I want to go to you first, and I want to ask you about one of King's books, Strength to Love.
Yeah.
What does it mean? I mean, I don't even have to unpack that for you. What does that mean for a contemporary moment?
I go back to something I mentioned earlier, that doing the work that I do from a faith perspective makes my it makes my work a little bit different than perhaps if I try to approach this without any sort of faith background, because I am compelled to do what I do, not from a place of seeking revenge or seeking to replace whiteness with blackness, but I'm compelled to do it from a place of Christ-like love. And that means for me that there's a certain way that I'm called to go about my work. There are many days when I could be consumed by, and rightfully so, the hatred because of what's been done to my people. But Christ compels me to love and love, not in some sappy write a love letter for Valentine's Day kind of way, but love the enemy in such a way that I demand they do better. Like when I'm talking to white brothers and sisters and calling them out of fear and silence and complacency, that's love. And it is also motivated by the fact that if they don't step forward, Black and brown bodies are killed because of their fear and silence. And so I've made the decision, as much as I am a product of the Black church and love the Black church, I serve a multi-ethnic church because I know the work that we're called to do, the amount of work that it takes to change America can't be done just by Black folks. And so there's some responsibilities that sit with our white brothers and sisters and other ethnic communities as well. And being in a multi-ethnic church allows me to bring others along on the journey. And so Strength to Love for me, when I think about that title, is really speaks to how I choose to go about my work. It doesn't change my work. I am still here for the empowerment, uplift of Black people. But it means that I'm inviting some folks along because I love them and because I know they share in this work with me.
Wonderful. Thank you, Pastor.
Leslie. Yeah, I'm ready. You don't even have to ask me. You don't even have to ask me a question.
Go ahead. Why we can't wait.
So Pastor Williams, the point that he made, I just can't overstate it, right? And I want to just give a little bit of context to the NAACP that people might not know, right? So the NAACP was founded in 1909, and it was founded actually by majority white people, right? We know there were a number of Black elite like W.B. Du Bois and Ida B. Wells and a number of people who were at the table as well. But this burden is not ours alone. Black people didn't create white supremacy. If anything, I would argue the burden is more on white people, and more white people should be fighting for racial justice and fighting for racial equity. Not us. I should be able to kick back my feet and I should be an advisor. Amen. That's what should happen. Okay. And so when Pastor Williams talks about bringing our white brothers and sisters to the table, that is so important. And it's something that I really want people to take this as your own. Right? Like really understand it. And so our first president of the National NAACP is someone who I really love, Moorfield Story, who I try to tell more people about. He was a former president of the National ABA, and he was a constitutional lawyer and a white man with a lot of privilege that recognized that the brutality that the Black community was facing wasn't our burden alone. It was the burden of all people who believe in humanity, and specifically people of faith, right? So I think that is very important. And so now you can ask me a question, Dr.
You just made that was brilliant. Thank you, Leslie. I'm going to ask you about this book, Why We Can't Wait, that title.
Amen. Amen. You know, those who believe in justice cannot wait. Amen. Like it's really just as simple as that. And, you know, justice delayed is justice denied. And I don't want to get too sad, but I've been working on a lot of innocence cases lately. Like I mentioned, Mayan Burrell, and I'm working on another case of a brother whose name I won't say just yet, because this is going to be really big. And he also has suffered for over 17 years in prison for a murder that he did not commit. And there are so many witnesses coming forward talking about the corruption of the police department and really forcing and threatening them to lie on this man. So when we talk about like now is the time, like now is the time. And I'm so excited because I believe we're living in a season where the first shall be last and the last shall be first, right? And if I could just say one point to the compassion and the strength to have love that you said, you know, with Don't Complain, Activate, I lead with 3 C's. Communication, collaboration, and compassion. And I always say compassion is what really anchors it. And one of my favorite Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King quotes is talks about how darkness cannot draw darkness. Only light can do that. Just like hate cannot draw hate, only love can do that. So I always remind myself, no matter how mad people make me, no matter how shady white supremacy is, I promise myself I'm gonna always lead from love, right? Because I never want to become my oppressor. I never want to become anybody else's oppressor. And if we're not careful to heal and to build, the oppressee often becomes the oppressor. And I think we have to be very careful and very diligent and to continue to fight, but make sure that we are fighting to help restore humanity as a whole and become better people.
Thank you, Leslie. And we're going to go to question and answers, but I am going to get this question into Adair because he gets the final title. Before that, please, if you're joining us virtually, check out Sanctuary Covenant on the web. Check out Don't Complain, Activate. Check out Pillsbury United. Look at the incredible work that these individuals are doing collectively for the Twin Cities and beyond, I would argue. But Adair, you get the hardest question. My favorite book, you mentioned it earlier. Where do we go from here, chaos or community?
You know, that I was hoping that was what you were going to ask me about. You know, the book is really undergirded by a vision of hope, and I think in these moments we have to be hopeful that there is a better tomorrow. And I believe, you know, Dr. King oftentimes tells us, right, that it is about this level of unity, that this is all of our work. As much as what Leslie said, to be able to undo these really unjust societal issues that we're all facing, that it is the labor of everyone. And when we get to the end, we should all be filthy. We should all be dirty. Our hands should be dirty because we've worked tirelessly to make sure that we are doing what is right by people. And it is evident that in this moment that we will not be able to survive. Our democracy cannot survive under chaos, right? Our society cannot survive it. And so this is going to have to be about community and everyone pulling the lever of which you own. I'm not asking you to go out there and try to, you know, dismantle a system that you don't know how, but there's the small p, big P in policy. Right? There's small c in community and big C, right? And do the things that are within your purview. If you only do that, if you only talk to your friends at the dinner table, which are largely a homogenous group of individuals, if you talk to them about the systems and about the inequities, and you start there, I believe that it will have a ripple effect throughout our society to be able to create this really just vision that we all see. So where we go from here is simply community. And I think that's the question of this moment. Where do we go from here?
Beautifully stated, Adair. Thank you. Very quickly, before we take our first question, Pastor Williams, where can people find you on the website?
So our church website is sanctuarycov.org. I'm also on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, just Edrin, Edrin Williams. Yeah, or just come to North Minneapolis and you'll find me.
We'll follow you on Twitter. Be prepared for some serious uplift if you are following Pastor Williams there. Leslie Redmond, where can people find you?
Grace and peace. So you can find me on all social media platforms at Leslie E. Redmond. So right there. And also my website is leslieredmond.com. And if you want to shop, Don't Complain, Activate, it's simply leslieredmond.com/shop DCA. But if you go to leslieredmond.com, you can also find the merchandise through there. And if you want to reach out to me, you can reach out to me through my website, leslieredmond.com.
And Adair, where can folks link up with you and with Pillsbury?
Yeah, so Pillsbury's website is pillsburyunited.org. And then I'm on social media channels, as Pastor Williams has mentioned as well. So, and again, or you can come to North or South Minneapolis for Pillsbury.
Love that. We're going to take our first question now. So I'll ask our backstage wizards to put that up. So the question here is from Julia Zhang. Minnesota is home to some huge Fortune 500 companies. Most meaningful way corporation can Adair. Start with you.
Yeah, absolutely. The only way for us to be able to really get at these deep systemic issues is going to be through cross-sector partnership, and is one of the things that I lift up. And it is about our public sector and private sector, and the third sector, the nonprofit, and in that nonprofit is faith, of course, to be able to come together and look at this. And it's about the intersectionality of those sectors pulling the levers. I believe in this moment that our corporations are saying the right things. It'll be proven to see if their actions follow. And some of them are putting bold and courageous plans out of not only about diversifying their workforce, but about that corporations won't even be able to thrive with such deep inequities in our society. And so they have been silent for far too long. And it's really sad that it took the death of George Floyd for many of them to say publicly that Black Lives Matter, or really have these bold and courageous goals towards justice. And so I believe that if we can harness this energy, that they will be a powerful force and a much needed force. And actually, our policymakers will listen to them. And it's unfortunate, right, that they don't listen to the community, those constituents that they serve. But if they use their platforms and their power behind community, I believe we can get to this enduring change. Thank you.
Leslie or Pastor Williams?
I can go next. Dr. Yahuwah, before I go, where can the people find you at? You didn't tell them that.
I am in Minneapolis with all three of you doing the work, but I am at the University of St. Thomas, the Racial Justice Initiative. Thank you, Leslie. I appreciate that.
You're
very
so
much.
welcome.
What about corporations? I know you talk about this a lot. What can corporations do?
This is very important, and I want to note that I prayed for this moment. Honestly, when I was doing my MBA program, I really got a better understanding of the important roles that businesses play. And throughout history, honestly, there's been, through the business community, really stepping up in a meaningful way that has helped shape so many industries, whether it's education, whether it's health, all of these. So actually, I'm at a table right now that I'm really excited about. You all are going to be seeing me do the work with several different corporations who are really ready to do the work and that are ready to make a contract with the community and really operate in a real meaningful way. And if you know me, I'm going to make sure that they do it as much as I can and keeping you all updated. But I'm very excited that they're at the table because for so long, they were silent, and silence equals consent. And I think when they saw Officer Chauvin suck the life out of Brother George Floyd with those over 8 minutes of kneeling on his neck, it was something that people cannot turn a blind eye to anymore. So, we are home to more Fortune 500 companies per capita than any other state, and it's long overdue that they step up. But I do believe that many of them are ready to step up, and we're going to look forward to holding them accountable.
Thank you, Leslie. Pastor Williams?
Yeah, I would just echo what Adair and Leslie have said. It happens first with investment, putting actual dollars behind the statements and the gestures coming out of what happened last summer with George Floyd's untimely death. I think it's partnering with the people in community who are actually doing the work. Like, we're not asking these large corporations to come establish some presence in the community and then create something new. There are people who have been there for long times doing the work. Figure out how to partner with those folks and support their work. I'll also add, we need our corporations to care for and support the Black and brown employees that are within their own companies. One of the things that I was so surprised about when we moved here to the Twin Cities from South Carolina was how many other large amounts of people come to the Twin Cities for work. And the experience is so hard for them that after 2 years, they're out of here. And so there's something about the Twin Cities corporations needing to create the culture and caring for those employees. So this can be a place that they can call home, that they can invest in, put down roots, and that little kids growing up on the north side can know that there are folks who look just like them working at Target Corporation and General Mills and Pentair and those other corporations, because these companies have made investments and have supported their employees and have done the good work on the ground.
Appreciate that. We'll take that next question, please. So this one is from Colin Owens. What best practices do you see that need to be included in creating policy? Leslie, please.
I can start off. So for like 4 years, I was working on the Met Council Equity Advisory Committee. And one of the things that I really liked that came out, we were talking a lot about equity lenses or like an equity checklist. So like before anything is actually passed, not just looking at how much it's helping the Black community, but how much it could hurt the Black community, right? And because a lot of the times, especially
the culture and caring.
They talk a lot about, what was the intention, but it's not just about your intention, it's about your impact, right? Okay. And so really making sure that you are taking time to examine how you're going to help the community and also harm the community, and not just in theory, but actually having a protocol and a checklist that you're going through. So I think that would be very helpful.
Such great points. Pastor Williams, Adair?
Yeah, the other thing I'll add to that is that community should be really shaping policies rather than policies shaping community.
Yeah.
And so we have to figure out a mechanism and a way to be able to get the voices of people into legislative bodies in listening sessions to be able to shape the policies. The other thing is, frankly, we're going to have to diversify our policymakers. It is shameful that a majority of white men are making policies for the rest of us, right? Without any understanding, without any proximity to community, without any level of empathy, with no empathetic approach to policy making. And whether intentional or unintentional, it's going to be formed through the lens of really a white supremacy lens that is going to have oppressive downstream impacts on our communities. And so if you are in this work and you labor, and this doesn't mean that there's not a place at the table for the white man, right? But how do you put yourself in proximity and really a deeper understanding that helps shape that policy? So to Leslie's point, so you can clearly understand the impact, and then how do we create tools and mechanisms for community to start shaping policies?
Thank you, Adair. I am going to take the next question. I'm going to apologize. The conversation was so good that questions, we won't get to them all, but we will try to get as many in as possible. This one's from Mel Boynton. He asks, Dr. King said only light can end darkness. What is the most important candle we can light today? Great question. Pastor.
Mel's being poetic, and I love it. I think to follow the analogy, I think Mel acknowledging that there's darkness, great darkness in America, and that it is sucking the life out of Black and brown people, and then committing to do something about that darkness. It's not enough to just point out that this is a broken place, but to actually commit to do something about it. I think that is the most important candle, to start by acknowledging the truth, because there's no reconciliation without truth first.
I would add, listening to Black people, listening to Black women, trust in Black people, trust in Black women. That's going to be super important. And it goes to what Adair was talking about, really allowing the people who are most impacted really be the ones who are impacting policy and how we move forward.
Great point. Adair?
I'll let you get to the next question. I think they both have made very great points.
Thank you. Next question, please. So this is from S. Porter. How do we influence Minneapolis public schools to truly serve their Black and brown community?
It's just not Minneapolis public schools, right? As mentioned early on, like all of our systems are just categorically not serving Black and brown students or Black and brown people in communities. I believe that in this moment, one of the biggest things that we have to be able to center is economic justice, education justice. And without solving for those two edifices, that we truly won't be able to get the level of parity and justice that we all seek. And that is going to, as much as we're talking about reimagining our public safety, we really need to be talking about reimagining and dismantling our systems of education. That we're using a system that is centuries old to really educate, and that is laden with a white supremacist kind of curriculum and instruction on Black and brown communities. We frankly need to be thinking about how do we get more educators of color, but also how do even those that are well-meaning whites how they can also be oppressive, as Dr. King talked about, right? To and harmful to Black and brown bodies. And frankly, I don't think that we will just get there with marginal fixes. It is going to need to be a true reimagination of this system. And frankly, education is long overdue for that radical reimagination.
So before I was a president for the Minneapolis NAACP, I was a vice president. Before I was a vice president, I was the education chair. And I am so disgusted with Minneapolis Public School. Not only is it failing our children, it is literally oppressing them. And it is one of our major focus points that we need to be really honing in on. I'm thankful Sharon El-Amin just got elected to the school board. I think the school board is very important. Running good candidates is super important. A superintendent that's really ready to create change and transformation is going to be vital. Again, when we talk about we cannot wait. Like, this school system is literally oppressing our kids. Malcolm X said only a fool will allow their enemy to educate their children. And that's precisely what they are doing. Our children are not being taught our history when Black people in the Black community is trying to inform and to educate and actually telling them tools that are going to elevate and help our children. They're completely falling on deaf ears. You have programs and institutions like NICAT, the Network for the Development of Children of African Descent, that are literally saving our kids and boosting their educational rates. And the Minneapolis school system denies and will not work with them. And so there's so much work to be done, but I believe that it's going to be the community that saves themselves, as we always have. And I have no hope and faith in the Minneapolis public school system.
We're going to take our next question just because we are running low on time. This is from L. Smith. How do we translate this movement to our young people?
Yeah, I love that question. And I love the person who answered that question. That's a relative of mine from South Carolina. So South Carolina is on the map. I think the beauty of what we're talking about here is our story, the story of Black people, the story of brown people, the story of those who have overcome and helped make America what it is. And the beauty of it is we have stories that have been passed down from the older generation to us that we should be passing down to our children as well. I think as much as when we talk about justice work, we talk about breaking down the systems that are oppressing us, there are some things within our community that we have to do a much better job of celebrating as well. I think when God made us, and I'm talking specifically to Black folks right now, God did some incredible work. And so we've got to celebrate ourselves. We got to tell our stories. We've got to celebrate our successes, be honest about our shortcomings, but remind our kids from as early as we can that they come from great stock. They are not just someone waiting for somebody to come help them. There is greatness in all of us. And then we can tell that in stories and learn our own history. I think that's one way that we pass it on to the kids.
And I would just add on the importance of reading and, again, seeing ourselves in books. This summer, Don't Complain Activate sponsored in collaboration with the NAACP and Sammy's Avenue Eatery and a couple other organizations like NICAT, the Books and Breakfast Tour, which Pillsbury should look into funding. It was an amazing opportunity to get out in the community and to actually push Black authors and Black books where children could see themselves in the literature. And I think there's so many ways that we can take it even more steps forward. But obviously we need to get some funding. But Books and Breakfast Tours are really important because you're feeding the community physically and also mentally. And that's going to help really activate our children. And I would also like to just point to that question that the children are watching. They're very aware and alert of what's going on. And I believe that we need people to help break it down and help them to really digest all of the information that they're taking in.
Yeah. Hey, Leslie, there's a church on the corner of Broadway and Aldridge that you should also ask about helping them fund that because, not just Pillsbury. There are others too.
Amen. Don't complain, activate, okay?
Coming to you, Dr. Williams. I mean, I keep Pastor Williams, but you are Dr. in my eyes. Yeah. Dr. Williams, the only thing I'll add to, and Leslie mentioned this early on, but the youth have always been at the cornerstone and foundation of social justice and change and moments, right, in activating against war, right, thinking about LGBTQ rights and really college campuses serving as really nexuses in our community for this level of change. And I think it's incumbent upon us to how do we center their voices in this moment? How do we create more platforms for them to elevate their voice, find their agency, and create the change? And, as the Bible tells us, right, and a child shall lead them. And I believe that is the work, to be able to create ways of making sure that we center their voices in this time.
Thank you, Adair. Unfortunately, we are at time, so I'm going to have to wrap us up. I want to thank our guests today, Adair Mosley, Pastor Edrin Williams, and of course, Leslie Redmond, for your incredible work and for your contributions to this conversation. For everyone else, please know that this is just the start of a week-long of programs focused on centering Black voices through the Minnesota Historical Society. And tomorrow evening, we will have another panel on the history and legacy of HBCU leadership. Historically, Black colleges and universities have been at the forefront of major changes in American society and culture, and we'll tackle that tomorrow with a brand new panel. In the meantime, light a candle for justice, light a candle for truth, and find a way to stand consistent with the message of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. Thank you and have a great evening.